The first man who died under Megan Hale's watch had a name she never learned. He came through the canvas flap of the aid station on a stretcher, his torso dark with blood that had already begun to freeze at the edges. 2 operators carried him, their breath ragged, their faces ghost-white beneath tactical balaclavas crusted with ice. Behind them, the storm howled like something ancient and hungry, pushing snow sideways through the gap before the flaps slammed shut again. Megan stood near the back wall of the tent, her bolt-action rifle still slung across her chest, the cold radiating off her gear in waves. She had just come down from Overwatch position on the eastern ridge, 6 hours prone in -20 wind chill, 6 hours watching the approach through a scope frosted at the edges, her trigger finger cycling through a numbness she had trained herself to ignore. Now she was inside, and inside was worse. The forward aid station had been designed for short engagements. A cache confirmation, a 2-hour window. Extract before weather closed in. That was the brief. That was the plan. Plans die fast in mountains like these. The storm had come early. Not the light snow that had been forecasted. Not something you could push through with night vision and discipline. This was a wall. A wideout. Visibility dropped to 20 yards in under 90 minutes. And when it did, the ambush came with it. Now the tent was full of blood and shouting, and the wet sounds of men trying to keep other men alive. The 2 medics worked in the center of the space, their hands moving fast, their voices overlapping. Corpsman Third Class Reyes knelt beside a seal with a sucking chest wound, his fingers pressing a chest seal into place while blood bubbled through the edges. Across from him, Sergeant First Class Danny Vance was cutting away a shredded pant leg, exposing a femoral bleed that pulsed in time with a wounded man's fading heartbeat. And more were coming. Megan could hear them outside. The crunch of boots in deep snow, the grunts of exertion, the low moans of men too proud to scream but too broken to stay silent. 2 more stretchers pushed through the flap, then another, then another. The tent was 12 feet by 16. It had been set up for 6 beds. Now there were 9 men on the ground, and the 10th was being lowered onto a folded tarp because there was nowhere else to put him. Reyes looked up, his face slick with sweat despite the cold. His eyes found Megan's across the chaos. Hale, you have medical. She shook her head once. Basic trauma. Nothing surgical. Then stay out of the way. She didn't argue. She stepped back against the reinforced canvas wall and watched. That was what she did. That was what she had always done. Observe. Calculate. Wait. But as she watched, something cold settled into her chest. Colder than the wind outside. Colder than the ice that had been forming on her eyelashes for 6 hours. The system was failing. Not because the men working it were weak. Not because they lacked courage or training or will. Reyes and Vance were among the best combat medics she had ever worked with. The corpsmen assisting them had saved lives in worse conditions. But there were only 3 of them, and casualties were arriving faster than they could process. If that opening hooked you, stay with me. This story only gets more intense. Subscribe now for more real stories of courage, and hit that notification bell. Drop a comment, and tell me where you're listening from. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, to the frozen lake in Michigan where Megan Hale first learned how to survive the cold. She was 7 years old. The lake behind her family's property had been frozen for 3 weeks. Solid enough to walk on. Solid enough for her father to drill holes for ice fishing. Solid enough that Megan had stopped thinking about what was underneath. She was walking toward the fishing shack when she heard the crack. Not a sharp sound. Not the dramatic splintering you see in movies. Just a low, groaning protest from somewhere beneath her boots. And then the ice shifted. And then it gave way. The water hit her like a fist. She remembered the shock more than the cold. The way her lungs seized. The way her muscles locked. The way every thought in her head scattered like birds fleeing a gunshot. She was going to die. She knew it with a certainty that only children and soldiers understand. The absolute, crystalline knowledge that this was the end. But then her father's voice cut through the chaos. Megan, count. She couldn't see him. The water was dark and churning, and her eyes wouldn't focus. But she heard him, somewhere above the surface. Somewhere on the ice that hadn't broken. Count to 10. Slow. Then move your arms. She counted. 1, 2, 3. Her lungs burned. Her chest felt like it was being crushed. 4, 5, 6. Her fingers found the edge of the ice, slick and crumbling. 7, 8, 9. She pulled. 10. Her father's hands closed around her wrists and dragged her out of the water, and she lay gasping on the solid ice, her whole body shaking, her mind still cycling through numbers she didn't need anymore. Later, wrapped in blankets by the wood stove, her father sat beside her and explained, "The cold shocks your system, makes you panic, but panic doesn't save you. Counting does. It gives your brain something to hold on to, a rhythm, a structure. You understand?" She nodded. She understood. And for the next 25 years, Megan Hale counted. She counted through biathlon competitions, her breath steady as she moved from skiing to shooting, her heart rate dropping on command. She counted through boot camp, through sniper school, through the endless hours of stalking exercises where a single twitch could mean failure. She counted through deployments that blurred together into a single long sequence of patience and precision. Counting was control. Counting was survival. And now, in this canvas tent on a frozen ridge in the high country, surrounded by blood and chaos and the sound of men dying, Megan Hale began to count again. 1, 2, 3. She watched Rhea's attempt to intubate a casualty, while simultaneously directing a junior operator to apply pressure to a wound. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from exhaustion, from the impossible mathematics of one man trying to do 3 jobs at once. 4, 5, 6. She watched Vance burn to the last tourniquet in his kit, then improvise one from a belt and a carabiner. It worked. Barely. The bleeding slowed but didn't stop. 7, 8, 9. She watched the corpseman, a young woman named Diaz, try to prioritize between 2 casualties arriving simultaneously. Her eyes darted back and forth. Her jaw clenched. She made a choice, moved a man on the left, and the man on the right stopped breathing 30 seconds later. 10. Megan exhaled. The system wasn't failing because of incompetence. It was failing because of throughput. Too many inputs. Not enough processing capacity. No structure to manage the flow. She had seen this before. Not in combat. In logistics. In the way ammunition resupply collapsed when multiple units called for support simultaneously. In the way extraction protocols broke down when helicopters arrived out of sequence. The solution was never more resources. Not in the short term. The solution was always reorganization, sequencing, rhythm. She looked at the plywood board mounted near the entrance of the tent. It was supposed to be the triage board. Names and status. Green, yellow, red, black. Standard protocol. It was blank. No one had time to write on it. Megan moved before she made the conscious decision to act. She crossed the tent in 4 steps, her boots leaving wet prints on the blood-slick floor. She pulled the greased pencil from its holder beside the board. She wiped the surface clean with her sleeve. Reyes looked up. "Hale, where are you?" "Shut up and keep working." Her voice was flat. No anger. No urgency. Just function. She wrote fast, her handwriting angular and precise. 2 columns. Left side, airway. Right side, bleed control. Below each column, she drew a horizontal line and wrote a number. 2. 2 operators on airways. 2 on bleed control. Rotate every 10 minutes. No exceptions. Vance stared at her. "We don't have 4 people. You have 3 medics and every wounded man who can still use his hands. Put them to work." She pointed at a SEAL lying on his back near the far wall. His left arm was in a sling, but his right hand was functional. He was staring at the ceiling, his jaw tight with pain. Can you apply pressure?" He nodded. "Then get over here and hold this dressing in place. Your bleed control for the next 10 minutes. The man hesitated for a fraction of a second, then rolled to his side and crawled toward the center of the tent. Megan turned to Diaz. "How long does it take you to establish an airway?" "Depends on the average." "Give me a number." Diaz blinked. 90 seconds. Maybe 2 minutes if there's obstruction. Then you get 2 minutes per patient. After that, you move. Stabilize and move. Don't wait for perfect. Wait for stable. I know it's not protocol. Protocol is drowning us. She wrote another line on the board. Stable window, 2 minutes. Reassess, 2 minutes. Tourniquet check, 5 minutes. The tent flap opened again. 2 more casualties came through, carried by operators who looked barely conscious themselves. One of the wounded was screaming. The other was silent, which was worse. Megan pointed at the screaming man. Bleed control. Left side. She pointed at the silent one. Airway. Center. She looked at Diaz. That one first. You have 90 seconds. Go. The corpsman went. For the first time since the ambush began, the chaos in the tent started to take shape. Not order. Not yet. But structure. A framework that could hold weight. Megan stepped back from the board and watched the flow. 2 medics working airways. Diaz floating between stations, providing surgical support where needed. Vance managing bleed control with 2 wounded operators assisting, their hands pressed dressings, their faces blank with control pain. She checked the frost on the tent poles near the entrance. It was building in layers. When she had entered the tent, the frost line had been 2 inches from the canvas. Now it was 4. Maybe 40 minutes had passed. Maybe more. Watches didn't work in this cold. Neither did most electronics. The satellite comm unit in the corner was dead, its battery drained by the temperature. They were alone. No air support. No QRF. No extraction. Just this tent, this ridge, and the storm that showed no sign of breaking. Another stretcher came through. Then another. Megan counted them as they entered. 6, 7, 8. The tally marks on the board grew. After an hour, she stepped outside. The cold hit her like a physical force, driving the breath from her lungs, making her eyes water instantly. She pulled her balaclava higher and scanned the ridge through the swirling white. 20 yards of visibility. Maybe less, but she could see the muzzle flashes. They came from a northern approach, sporadic but persistent. Enemy fighters using the storm as cover, probing the perimeter, testing for weaknesses. The SEALs had established defensive positions along the ridgeline, but the positions were thin. Too many men wounded, not enough left to hold the line. And if the line broke, the aid station was next. Megan moved to her rifle case, which she had left beside the entrance. She extracted the bolt-action weapon, checked the chamber, and began walking toward the northern edge of perimeter. "Hail!" A voice behind her. Senior Chief Garrett, the operational commander, emerged from the snow like a ghost. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. He had been awake for 36 hours. "Where are you going?" "Overwatch. We need you in the tent. That system you set up, the system is running. What we need is to stop the bleeding from outside." She nodded toward the muzzle flashes. "They're ranging the perimeter. If they find a gap, they'll push through. And then none of this matters." Garrett stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Don't stay out too long. You freeze, we lose both the shooter and the triage. I'll rotate." She moved north, keeping low, using the terrain for cover. The ridge was a nightmare of shale and ice, every surface slick, every foothold uncertain. She found a position behind a boulder formation that offered decent sight lines and began setting up. The scope was fogged. She wiped it clean, waited for it to adjust the temperature, then pressed her eye to the glass. Visibility was still terrible, but through the scope, she could make out shapes, movement, the distinctive silhouettes of men who were not her teammates. She counted them. 1, 2, 3. They were bunched together, moving toward a gap in the defensive line, where a wounded operator had been pulled back to the aid station. 4, 5. She adjusted for wind, for distance, for the cold's effect on her ammunition. 6. She exhaled half her breath. 7. She pulled the trigger. The first man dropped. The others scattered, diving for cover. Their approach halted. Megan worked the bolt, found her second target, fired again. The muzzle flashes from the northern approach went silent. She stayed in position for another 20 minutes, scanning, waiting, making sure they wouldn't regroup. Then she returned to the aid station. When she pushed through the tent flap, the scene inside had changed. The chaos was still there, but it had a rhythm now, a flow. Medics moved in patterns. Wounded operators assisted where they could. The triage board had grown to include time marks and patient numbers. Reyes looked up from his current patient. His hands were steadier now. You stopped the incoming from the north. For now. How many? 2 confirmed. The rest are holding back. He nodded, then returned to his work. Megan walked to the board and added 2 tally marks to a new section she had created. External. She would track enemy interdictions separately. The math was different but connected. Every shot that removed a threat bought time. Time bought stability. Stability bought survival. The night stretched ahead of them, endless and dark. Megan checked the frost on the tent poles. 6 inches now. She calculated the hours in her head. Too many ahead, too few behind. She picked up the grease pencil and wrote a new number at the top of the board. 30. 30 casualties processed since she had taken the marker. She thought about the man who had died first, the one whose name she never learned. He had been triaged before she started, before the system was in place. She wondered if the structure would have saved him. She wondered if it mattered. It didn't. Not now. Not anymore. What mattered was the next patient, and the one after that. The storm did not break. By midnight, the frost on the tent poles had reached 8 inches. Megan used it as a clock when everything else failed. The batteries in their tactical watches had died hours ago. The satellite comm unit remained dark. The generators outside were buried under snow, their fuel reserves unknown. Inside the tent, the air was thick with the smell of copper and antiseptic and something else, something primal that she had learned not to name. 60. The tally on the board had doubled. 60 casualties processed through the system she had built. Some had been stabilized and moved to a secondary holding area at the back of the tent. Others had been patched and returned to the line, their wounds bound tight, their hands gripping weapons they could barely feel. And some had died. She hadn't tracked those on the board. That wasn't the point. The point was throughput. The point was keeping the flow moving forward. But she knew the number anyway. She counted everything. 7. 7 men who had come through the tent flap and would not leave it alive. Megan stood at the board, updating the rotation schedule. Reyes was due for a break. He had been working for 4 straight hours, and his hands were starting to shake again. The tremor was subtle, invisible to anyone who wasn't watching, but she was always watching. Reyes, off rotation, 15 minutes. He didn't look up from the chest tube. He was inserting. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're one wrong move from killing someone. Now he looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, ringed with exhaustion. We don't have anyone to replace me. Megan pointed at a SEAL sitting against the far wall. His name was Brennan. He had taken shrapnel to the shoulder during the initial ambush, but his arm still worked. More importantly, his mind was clear. Brennan, you're on airway assist. Reyes talks you through it. You do exactly what he says. No improvisation. Brennan blinked. I'm not trained for... You're trained to follow orders under pressure. This is the same. Different equipment. Same discipline. She handed him a pair of nitrile gloves from the dwindling supply. He stared at them for a moment, then pulled them on. Reyes finished the chest tube, secured it, and stepped back. His jaw was tight, but he didn't argue. He moved to the secondary holding area and sat down on an empty stretcher, his head dropping into his hands. He would be back in 15 minutes. Megan would make sure of it. She checked the board again. The rotation was holding. 2 on airways, 2 on bleed control, 1 floater for surgical support. The wounded who could function were being integrated as they arrived. Hands to hold pressure, voices to keep patients conscious, bodies to move equipment. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't by the book, but it was working. The tent flap opened. 2 more casualties. One was conscious, gritting his teeth against a compound fracture of the tibia. The other was unconscious, his face pale, his breathing shallow. Megan pointed. Fracture to stabilization. Unconscious to airway station 2. The men who carried them obeyed without question. They had learned the system. They had seen it work. Outside, gunfire cracked through the storm. Sporadic. Testing. The enemy was still out there, still probing, still waiting for a gap. Megan checked her watch out habit, then remembered it was dead. She estimated the time based on the frost and her internal count, somewhere around 0200, maybe 0230. She had been awake for nearly 20 hours. She had eaten nothing since the insertion. Her body was running on adrenaline and discipline and a deep, Cold knowledge that stopping meant dying. She allowed herself 30 seconds. She sat down on an empty equipment case, closed her eyes, and counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Her breathing slowed. Her heart rate dropped. The noise around her faded to a distant hum. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. She opened her eyes. Back to work. She moved to the unconscious casualty at Airway Station 2. Diaz was working on him, her hands moving fast, her jaw clenched. What do we have? Blunt force trauma to the head. Possible TBI. Airway is compromised, swelling in the throat. I can't get the tube in. Megan looked at the man's face. He was young, early 20s. His eyes were half open, unfocused, staring at nothing. Cricket? Diaz shook her head. Used the last one 2 hours ago. Megan thought for half a second. Then she moved. She pulled a ballpoint pen from her pocket. Standard issue, carried for marking maps. She unscrewed it, removed the ink cartridge, and set the hollow barrel aside. Then she reached for the trauma shears on Diaz's belt. What are you doing? Emergency airway. Hold him still. She located the cricothyroid membrane by touch, the soft spot between the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid. She had trained for this once, in a classroom with mannequins and instructors who assured them they would never actually need to perform the procedure in the field. She made the incision. Blood welled up around the blade, but she didn't hesitate. She inserted the pen barrel, angling it carefully, and felt the rush of air as the improvised tube found its mark. The man's chest rose, fell, rose again. Diaz stared. That actually worked? It's holding. Stabilize him and move. Next patient in 90 seconds. Megan straightened and wiped the blood from her hands onto her pants. The fabric was already stiff with it. One more layer wouldn't matter. She returned to the board. 62. Outside, the gunfire intensified. Not probing anymore. A sustained assault. Megan grabbed her rifle. Reyes, you're back on rotation early. Diaz, take over the board. She didn't wait for acknowledgement. She pushed through the tent flap and into the storm. The cold was worse than before. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees, maybe more. Her exposed skin burned, then went numb. She pulled her balaclava tighter and moved toward the northern perimeter. The defensive line was holding, but barely. She counted the muzzle flashes from her side. 5 shooters, spaced 20 meters apart. Not enough. The enemy had figured out the gaps and was pushing through. She found her position behind the boulder formation. Set up. Acquired targets. 1, 2. She fired twice. 2 shapes dropped. 3, 4. 2 more rounds. 2 more confirmed. The assault wavered. The enemy fighters pulled back, dragging their casualties with them. She stayed in position, scope pressed to her eye, waiting. 10 minutes passed. 20. No movement. She returned to the aid station. The tally on the board now read 68. The external section showed 6. Megan added 2 more. 8 enemy interdictions. 8 threats neutralized. 8 more minutes of time bought for men inside. The math was simple, brutal, but it was the only math that mattered. The third hour of the second day began with a lull. The enemy pulled back. The storm continued. Inside the tent, the rhythm held. Megan used the pause to reorganize. She moved the stabilized patients to a more efficient arrangement at the back of the tent, creating a clear corridor from the entrance to the treatment stations. She restocked the supply caches that had been depleted, pulling from reserves they couldn't afford to touch but had no choice about. The tally read 74. Reyes approached her near the board. His break had restored some of the steadiness to his hands, but his eyes were still hollow. The system is working. She nodded. Where did you learn this? The rotation structure, the time lanes. This isn't standard triage. Megan looked at the board. The tally marks. The crude timeline she had constructed. Supply chain. What? Logistics. Managing throughput when resources are constrained. I read about it. Applied it to ammunition. Resupply once. Figured it would work here. Reyes stared at her. You're triaging casualties based on supply chain management. I'm triaging casualties based on what keeps the most people alive. The framework doesn't matter. The outcome does. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Some of the men are calling you something. A name. Megan's expression didn't change. I don't care about names. They're calling you the Angel of War. She turned away from the board, telling to focus on staying alive. Angels don't exist out here. Only math. But the name spread anyway. She heard it whispered among the wounded, passed between operators in low voices. Angel of War. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't praise. It was something else, a recognition that what was happening in this tent was beyond normal, beyond protocol, beyond what any of them had been trained for. She ignored it. She had work to do. The storm shifted around 0400, not breaking, but changing. The wind direction altered, pushing the snow from the north instead of the west. Visibility improved slightly, maybe 30 yards now instead of 20. It wasn't enough for air support, but it was enough for the enemy to regroup. The assault came from two directions this time, north and east, simultaneous. Megan heard it before she saw it. The distinctive crack of PKM fire, the sharper report of AK-47s, the heavier thud of RPGs impacting the perimeter. She grabbed her rifle and moved. The eastern approach was the more dangerous vector. The terrain provided better cover for attackers and worse sight lines for defenders. She positioned herself on a rocky outcrop overlooking the approach, ignoring the cold that seeped through her clothing and into her bones. Through the scope, she counted 12, maybe 15, moving in a loose formation, using the storm as concealment. She started shooting. 1, 2, 3. The first 3 dropped before the others realized they were being engaged. The formation scattered, fighters diving for cover, their momentum broken. 4, 5, 6. She worked the bolt methodically. Each shot placed with precision, each target selected for maximum disruption. 7. The 7th man was carrying an RPG. He was setting up the fire at the aid station. She shot him through the chest. The remaining fighters pulled back, dragging their wounded, disappearing into the white. On the northern approach, the SEALs had held. The assault, there had been a feint. A smaller force meant to divide attention, while the main attack came from the east. Megan returned to the tent. The tally read 82. While she had been outside, 14 more casualties had come through. The system had held without her. Diaz had managed the board. Vance had maintained the rotation. The wounded who could function had continued to assist. The framework was self-sustaining now. That was the point. That was what good systems did. They persisted beyond the person who built them. She added 7 marks to the external section. 15 enemy interdictions total. Vance looked up from his current patient. How many out there? At least 40. Maybe more. They're not retreating. They're regrouping. Can we hold? Megan considered the question. The math was not encouraging. They had maybe 20 able-bodied fighters left on the line. The enemy had numerical superiority and initiative. Without air support or reinforcement, attrition would eventually overwhelm them. But eventually could mean hours. And hours meant more time for the storm to break. More time for extraction to become possible. We hold until we can't. Vance nodded. That was enough. Megan allowed herself another 30 seconds of rest. She sat on the equipment case, closed her eyes, and counted. When she opened them, she noticed something on the tent pole nearest the entrance. A small decoration, a crucifix, made from bandage tape and a broken tongue depressor. One of the wounded men had made it. An offering, a prayer. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she returned to the board. The work continued. She reorganized the casualty flow to account for the increased volume. She staggered incoming wounded 2 at a time. Any more, and the tent flooded. She created a secondary triage station at the entrance, sorting patients before they reached the main treatment area. The hours blurred together. Time became meaningless. There was only the count, the rhythm, the endless cycle of assessment, treatment, movement. 85, 90, 92. The enemy attacked twice more during the night. Both times, Megan moved the perimeter, engaged targets, broke the assault, and returned to the tent. The external tally grew. 21, 23, 26. 26 shots. 26 threats eliminated. 26 small adjustments to the math that kept them alive. By dawn, or what passed the dawn behind the endless gray of the storm, the tally read 98. 98 casualties processed. 98 men who had passed through the system she built. 22 of them were dead. She didn't write that number on the board, but she carried it. The storm began to weaken at 0730 on the third day. Megan noticed it first in the frost. The accumulation on the tent poles had slowed, then stopped, then begun to recede. The temperature was still brutal, but the wind had dropped. The snow was falling vertically now instead of sideways. She stepped outside and looked up. For the first time in 36 hours, she could see sky. Not much, just patches of lighter gray between the clouds, but it was there. The ceiling was lifting. She returned to the tent and found Senior Chief Garrett. Weather's breaking. We might have a window. Garrett's eyes sharpened. The fatigue was still there, but so was something else now. Hope. How long? Unknown. Could be minutes. Could be hours. But if we're going to call for extraction, we need to do it now. Garrett moved to the comm station in the corner. The satellite unit had been dead for hours, but they had been nursing a backup radio, keeping it warm against body heat, rationing the battery for exactly this moment. He keyed the handset. Viper Base, this is Ridge Element. Priority extraction. Multiple casualties. Grid coordinates to follow. Static. Then faintly, Ridge Element Viper Base. We copy. Weather check shows possible window at your location. Birds are spinning up. ETA to coordinates, 30 minutes. Megan heard the words and felt nothing. Not relief. Not hope. Just the next problem. 30 minutes. For helicopters, based on standard extraction protocol. Call it 8 casualties per bird. Maybe 10 if they packed them tight. 32 to 40 total capacity. She looked at the board. The tally read 103. 103 casualties. Some critical. Some moderate. Some stable enough to be ambulatory if you gave them a rifle and pointed them at the bird. Standard evacuation protocol said you move the worst cases first, the ones most likely to die without immediate surgical intervention. You packed them into the first birds, flew them to definitive care, and came back for the rest. But standard protocol assumed the storm would hold, assumed the window would stay open, assumed there would be time for multiple rotations. Megan looked at the sky again. The patches of lighter gray were already narrowing. The clouds were starting to compress. The window was closing. She turned to Garrett. 1 rotation. That's all we're going to get. What? The weather. Look at it. This window is 30 minutes, maybe 45. The birds can make 1 trip. That's it. After that, the ceiling drops and we're back where we started. Garrett stared at the sky, then back at her. Then we move the criticals first. Get them on the first birds. No. The word hung in the air. Garrett's eyes hardened. What do you mean, no? Megan stepped closer, lowering her voice. The tent was full of wounded men who did not need to hear this conversation. The criticals are the ones least likely to survive the flight. The temperature outside is still 20 below. The birds don't have proper climate control. A 30-minute flight in these conditions will kill a compromised patient faster than keeping them inside. So what's your solution? Leave them here to die. Hold them inside. Keep them warm. Keep them stable. Pray the window reopens. And the moderates? Move them first. Pack the birds with everyone who can survive the flight. Maximize the number who reach definitive care. Garrett was silent. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. The math. The terrible, impossible math. That's not protocol. Protocol assumes optimal conditions. These aren't optimal conditions. The command review. The command review is a problem for later. Right now, the problem is getting as many of these men out as possible. And that means inverting the standard order. Garrett looked at the tent, at the rows of wounded men, at the medics who have been working for 30 hours straight, at the system of tally marks and rotation schedules that had somehow held them together through the worst night of their lives. How many do we lose your way? Megan didn't flinch. Unknown. Some of the criticals won't survive the wait, but more of the moderates will reach the or in time. Net outcome, higher survival rate. You don't know that. I know the math. The math is all I have. Garrett closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had changed. The weight of command settling onto his shoulders like a physical burden. Do it. Megan moved. She reorganized the tent for the 3rd time that night. Moderate cases to the front. Criticals to the back. closest to the heat source, wrapped in every blanket they could spare. She assigned 2 of the wounded who could still function to monitor the critical patients, checking vitals every 5 minutes, calling for intervention if anything changed. The first helicopter arrived at 0803. It was a Black Hawk, its rotors kicking up clouds of powder snow as it settled onto flat ground beyond the perimeter. The crew chief jumped out, his face set with professional urgency. How many? 10 this bird. Moderate cases. They can sit upright. The crew chief didn't question it. He started directing the loading, packing wounded men into the cabin with the efficiency of long practice. The second helicopter landed 2 minutes later. Then the third. Then the fourth. Megan stood at the tent entrance, coordinating the flow, calling out names and directing movement. The tally on her board shrank with each departure. 103, 93, 83, 73. The fourth bird lifted off at 0821. 40 men evacuated, 63 remaining. The sky was darkening again, the clouds compressing, the window closing. But the birds were coming back. At 0839, the first helicopter returned, then the second. The pilots were pushing their limits, flying faster than regulations allowed, banking harder, descending more steeply. They knew the window was closing. They knew this was it. Megan loaded more wounded. More tally marks erased from the board. 63, 53, 43. The third rotation began at 0852. By now, the ceiling had dropped to maybe 500 feet. The pilots were flying on instruments, trusting their training, trusting their machines, trusting that the woman on the ground knew what she was doing when she told them which patients to take. Megan kept loading. 43, 33, 23. At 0907, a fifth helicopter appeared through the clouds. It wasn't part of the original extraction package. The pilot had volunteered, broken off from a resupply mission, diverted to the ridge on his own authority. Megan didn't know his name. She never learned it. But when his bird landed, she had 10 more seats to fill, and she filled them. 23, 13. The fourth rotation began at 0918. The criticals went now. The ones who'd been held inside, kept warm, kept stable. Some of them were conscious, their eyes tracking Megan as she coordinated their loading. Some of them were not. She counted them as they passed. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 critical cases loaded onto the fourth rotation. Their odds were worse than they would have been 20 minutes ago, but they were still alive, still breathing, still counting. The last bird lifted off at 0931. The tent was empty. Megan stood in the center of the canvas space that had been her world for 30 hours. The triage board hung on the wall, its surface covered in greased pencil marks, tally counts, timestamps, rotation schedules. The final number at the top read 120. 120 casualties evacuated, 12 dead on the ridge, 108 who would reach definitive care. She stared at the number for a long time. Then she walked to the board, picked up the greased pencil, and added a single line at the bottom. 0 remaining. The storm closed and again at 0945. The window had lasted exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes. By the time the last helicopter cleared the ridgeline, visibility was already dropping below minimums. The clouds compressed into a solid gray ceiling, and the snow resumed its horizontal assault. Megan was still on the ridge. She had not loaded herself onto any of the extraction birds. There had always been one more casualty, one more seat needed, one more adjustment to math. And by the time she looked up and realized she was the only one left, it was too late. The perimeter was still hot. Enemy fighters remained in the area, pushed back by the firefights of the night, but not eliminated. Somewhere in the white expanse beyond her sight lines, they were regrouping, reconsolidating, waiting. Megan moved to her overwatch position. The cold was worse now than it had been all night. Her body had been running on adrenaline and discipline for so long that the crash, when it came, hit her like a physical impact. Her muscles burned. Her eyes struggled to focus. Her trigger finger felt distant, disconnected from her brain. She forced herself to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Her breathing steadied. Her hands stopped shaking. 6, 7, 8. 9, 10. She pressed her eye to the scope and scanned the northern approach. Movement, 50 meters out. 2 fighters, maybe 3, using the storm as cover, creeping toward the abandoned perimeter. She adjusted for windage, for distance, for the cold that made her ammunition behave differently than it should. She fired. 1 down. The others scrambled for cover. She worked the bolt, found the second target, fired again. 2 down. The third disappeared into the white. Megan stayed in position. She had 7 rounds left in her current magazine, 2 spare magazines in her vest. Enough for a while. Maybe long enough for the storm to break again. Maybe long enough for a secondary extraction. Maybe she thought about the lake in Michigan, the ice giving way, the water closing over her head, her father's voice cutting through the panic. Count. She counted. The hours passed. At some point, she couldn't say when exactly, the gunfire stopped. The probing attacks from the perimeter ceased. Either the enemy had pulled back or they had decided the ridge wasn't worth the cost anymore. It didn't matter. She stayed in position. At 14:23, the storm broke again. This time it was decisive. The clouds parted, the wind died, and weak winter sunlight filtered down onto the frozen shale. Megan squinted against the brightness after so many hours of gray. She heard the helicopters before she saw them. 2 Black Hawks, approaching from the southwest, their rotors beating a rhythm that she recognized at some cellular level. The sound of salvation, the sound of home. She didn't move from her position until the first bird was on the ground. Then she walked, slowly, deliberately, her rifle still in her hands, toward the landing zone. The crew chief was the same one from the morning. He looked at her like he was seeing a ghost. Sergeant Hale? That's me. We thought you were on the last bird. I wasn't. He didn't ask for an explanation. He just stepped aside and let her climb aboard. She sat in the doorway of the helicopter as it lifted off, her legs dangling over the edge, her eyes watching the ridge recede below her. The tent, the perimeter, the frozen ground that had been soaked with blood for 30 hours. 120. That was the number. That was all that mattered. She closed her eyes and counted. The debrief happened 3 days later. Megan sat in a conference room at the forward operating base, her hands folded on the table, her face expressionless. Across from her, a panel of officers reviewed the incident report with the careful attention of men who had never been on that ridge and never would be. Colonel Anders, the senior officer present, looked up from the documents. Your decision to invert the evacuation protocol, moving moderate cases before critical, has been flagged for review. Megan nodded. The standard procedure exists for a reason, Sergeant. Critical cases first. That's doctrine. I'm aware of the doctrine, sir. Then explain your reasoning. She had expected this. She had prepared for it. But preparing for something and living through it were different things. The window was closing, sir. 1 rotation, maybe 2 if we pushed it. Standard evacuation would have packed the first birds with critical cases who had minimal chance of surviving the flight. The cold alone would have killed half of them before they reached the ore. So you made a judgment call. I made a calculation. Net survival rate. If I moved the moderates first, patients stable enough to survive the cold, more of them would reach definitive care in time. The criticals were held inside, kept warm, kept stable until the later rotations. Some of the criticals died. 4 of them, sir, during the hold. But 19 moderates who would have died waiting reached the ore in time. Net outcome, 15 additional survivors. Anders was quiet. The other officers exchanged glances. You're describing triage as a mathematical problem. Triage is a mathematical problem, sir. The only question is which math you use. The silence stretched. Finally, Anders closed the folder. The incident report will note your actions as effective measures under extreme conditions. No formal disciplinary action will be taken. However, your name will not appear in the commendation documents. The deviation from protocol makes official recognition complicated. Megan nodded. She had expected that too. Dismissed. She stood, saluted, and walked out of the conference room. Outside in the harsh sunlight of the base, she found Senior Chief Garrett waiting. He looked better than he had on the ridge. Rested, cleaned up, but his eyes still carried the weight of those 30 hours. Heard the review went well. It went. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the men are talking about you. I know. They're calling you the Angel of War. I know that too. He turned to face her fully. It's not a joke to them. It's not poetry. It's how they understand what happened up there. You held the line. You kept the system running. You saved 120 men. 108. 12 died on the ridge. 108 who made it to the ore. 96 who are still alive today. That's what the final count came to. Megan absorbed the number. 96. It was lower than 120. Lower than 108. But it was still a number. Still something she could hold on to. I didn't save anyone. I just managed the flow. That's what angels do, Garrett said. They don't fight the war. They keep it organized. She didn't have an answer for that. 3 weeks after the ridge, Megan returned to duty. There was no ceremony, no formal acknowledgement. She simply reported to the sniper platoon, collected her gear, and prepared for the next mission. But something had changed. She noticed in the way other operators looked at her, not with suspicion or curiosity, but with something else. Respect, maybe, or recognition. The kind of acknowledgement that soldiers give to someone who has been tested and proven. The nickname followed her everywhere. Angel of War. She heard it whispered in the mess hall, muttered during pre-mission briefs, written in marker on a spare magazine that someone had left on her bunk. She never acknowledged it. She never corrected it. She just kept working. The rifle needed cleaning. She cleaned it. The scope needed calibration. She calibrated it. The next mission needed a sniper. She was a sniper. On the evening before her first deployment after the ridge, she sat alone in the armory, running through her pre-mission ritual. Bolt check, magazine count, scope alignment, the same sequence she had performed 1,000 times before. Reyes found her there. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her work, then walked over and sat down on the bench beside her. I never thanked you. Megan didn't look up from her rifle. For what? For building the system. For making us work when we should have broken. He paused. For taking the shot on that guy with the RPG. If you hadn't, you would have been hit. We all would have been hit. The tent, everyone inside. He was quiet for a moment. I've been doing this for 12 years. I've seen a lot of people in bad situations. I've never seen anyone do what you did. Megan set the rifle down and looked at him. I did what the situation required. That's all. That's what makes it remarkable. You didn't panic. You didn't freeze. You just adjusted. Like the whole thing was a problem to be solved. It was... Reyes shook his head slowly. For most people, that situation would have been a nightmare. Something to survive. For you, it was a system. You treated battlefield triage like a supply chain optimization problem. Because that's what it was. He stood up, preparing to leave. At the door, he turned back. The men who were there, the ones who made it, they're never going to forget what you did. And neither am I. He left. Megan sat in the silence of the armory for a long time. Then she picked up her rifle and finished the cleaning. The story of the ridge spread to the community in the way that such stories always spread, not through official channels, but through the quiet network of operators who had been there, who had seen the tally marks on the plywood board, who had watched a woman with a grease pencil impose order on chaos. It became training material eventually. At the Advanced Combat Medical course, instructors began teaching a variation of the triage system Megan had improvised. They called it throughput-based prioritization. They taught the timed lanes, the rotation schedules, the integration of ambulatory wounded into the treatment flow. They didn't use her name. The system was presented as doctrine, stripped of its origin, abstracted into principles and procedures. That was fine. Principles persisted longer than names. In the sniper platoon, her reputation became something else entirely. Not the Angel of War. That nickname had already transcended her, become something bigger than any one person, but something simpler, the one who counts. It was shorthand for a particular kind of discipline, the ability to impose structure on chaos, the willingness to do the math that others couldn't face. When missions went bad, and missions always went bad eventually, operators remember the woman who had stood at a plywood board with a greased pencil and kept 120 men alive through pure force of organization. They remembered the counting. Megan herself remembered something else. She remembered the first man who died, the one whose name she never learned, the one who came to the tent flap before she took the marker, before the system existed. She wondered, sometimes, if he would have survived under her structure, if the time lanes and the rotation schedules would have given him the extra minutes he needed. She never knew. She would never know. But she carried the question with her, a weight that balanced against the numbers, against the tally marks, against the 96 who were still alive because she had done the math and made the calls that no one else would make. On a morning 6 months after the ridge, Megan stood on a different mountain in a different country, her rifle pressed to her shoulder, her scope trained on a target 400 meters away. The sun was rising behind her, casting long shadows across the frozen landscape. She counted her breathing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She exhaled half her breath. 6, 7, 8, 9. She pulled the trigger. 10. The target dropped. She worked the bolt, scanned for secondary threats, found none. Then she lowered the rifle and looked at the sunrise. It was beautiful, red and gold and purple, spreading across the horizon like watercolor on canvas. The kind of sunrise that made you forget, just for a moment, that you were in a war zone, that people were dying, that the math never really balanced. She allowed herself 30 seconds. 1, 2, 3. She counted the colors as they shifted and changed. 4, 5, 6. She counted the clouds as they drifted across the sky. 7, 8, 9. She counted the heartbeats in her chest, steady and strong, still alive after everything. 10. Then she stood, secured her weapon, and returned to her platoon. There was work to do. There was always work to do. The angel of war walked back into the shadows, and the sunrise continued without her. Megan Hale's story shows us that heroism isn't always about the biggest moments. Sometimes it's about controlling the smallest ones when everything else falls apart. If this kept you engaged, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. Tell me, could you have made the call to hold the critical cases and move the moderates first? Subscribe if you haven't already. More stories like this are coming. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. 1 year later, Megan sat in a sterile conference room at the Pentagon, surrounded by officers she didn't know and bureaucrats whose names she had already forgotten. A projector displayed slides on the far wall, charts, statistics, after-action reports sanitized for consumption by people who would never see combat. She wasn't sure why she was here. The invitation had come through her command chain, a request for her presence at a lessons learned briefing regarding cold weather operations in mountainous terrain. No mention of the ridge. No mention of the tally marks or the greased pencil or the 30 hours without sleep. But she knew the briefing officer was a lieutenant colonel named Morrison. He had a crisp uniform and the practiced delivery of someone who had given this presentation 100 times. The incident on the ridge represents a paradigm shift in our understanding of forward medical operations under extreme conditions, Morrison said, clicking to the next slide. Traditional triage protocols assume adequate throughput, enough personnel to process casualties at the rate they arrive. When that assumption breaks down, as it did on the ridge, alternative frameworks become necessary. The slide showed a diagram. 2 columns, rotation schedules, timestamps. It was a cleaned-up version of the plywood board. Megan recognized her own system, abstracted and formalized, stripped of the blood and chaos that had given it birth. The key innovation, Morrison continued, was the integration of ambulatory casualties into the treatment workflow. By utilizing wounded personnel who retained functional capacity, the forward aid station effectively tripled its processing capability. He clicked to the next slide. Additionally, the decision to invert standard evacuation protocol, prioritizing moderate cases for initial extraction and holding critical cases until environmental conditions improved, resulted in a net increase in survival rate of approximately 18% compared to projected outcomes under traditional doctrine. Morrison paused, consulting his notes. This approach has been codified into a training module that will be deployed to all forward surgical teams in the coming quarter. We're calling it the Adaptive Triage Protocol, or ADP. Adaptive Triage Protocol. Megan stared at the slide. Her system had a name now. An acronym. It would be taught in classrooms and practiced in exercises, and eventually forgotten by most of the people who learned it until the day they needed it and couldn't remember who had created it or why. That was fine. That was how it should be. The briefing continued for another hour. Statistics, projections, recommendations. Megan listened without speaking, her face expressionless, her hands folded on the table. When it was over, Morrison approached her. "Sergeant Hale, I wanted to thank you for attending. Your insights were invaluable in developing the ADP framework." She nodded. "There's been discussion about recognition, a commendation, maybe something more." "I don't need recognition, sir." Morrison looked at her with the careful expression of a man who had spent his career navigating politics and protocol. "You saved 96 lives. That's not nothing. It was the mission, sir. The mission is what matters." He seemed to want to say more, but something in her eyes stopped him. He nodded instead and moved away. Megan left the Pentagon and walked into the gray Washington afternoon. The air was cold but not biting. Nothing like the ridge. Nothing like the storm that had almost killed them all. She found a bench overlooking the Potomac and sat down. The water moved slowly, dark and smooth, carrying debris toward the sea. She watched it for a long time, not thinking about anything in particular, just watching, just breathing. 1, 2, 3. A jogger passed behind her. A tourist took a photograph of the skyline. The world continued its endless rotation, indifferent to the woman on the bench and the weight she carried. 4, 5, 6. She thought about the men from the ridge, the 96 who survived. Some had reached out to her after the incident. Thank you notes, messages through mutual contacts. One had named his daughter Megan, which she found both touching and slightly embarrassing. 7, 8, 9. Others had not reached out. They had gone back to their lives, their families, their missions. They had survived, and survival was its own form of gratitude. 10. She stood and walked back toward the metro station. That evening, in her hotel room, she received a call from Garrett. He had been promoted to Master Chief, assigned to a training command in California. His voice sounded lighter than she remembered. "Heard you were at the Pentagon. News travels fast. It's a small community. How did it go?" She considered the question. They turned the triage system into a training module. ADP, Adaptive Triage Protocol. Garrett was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel about that?" "I feel like it's the right outcome. The system should persist. The name attached to it doesn't matter." "That's very zen of you." "It's practical. Names fade. Systems endure." "Some names endure too," Garrett said softly. "Angel of War." Megan didn't respond. "I heard Reyes is using it in his classes. At the combat medic school. He tells the story of the ridge, and when he gets to the part where you take the grease pencil, he stops and asks the students, 'What would you do?' Most of them don't have an answer. That's the point of training. Finding the answer before you need it. Maybe, but some answers can't be found in training. Some answers come from somewhere else." "Where?" Garrett paused. "I don't know. Wherever you found yours." She thought about the lake, the ice giving way, her father's voice. "Count. I should go," she said. "Early flight tomorrow." "Copy that. Stay safe, Hale." "You too, Senior Chief." She ended the call and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The adaptive triage protocol will be taught to thousands of medics over the coming years. Some of them would use it in combat. Some of them would use it in disasters. Some of them would use it and never know where it came from. That was legacy, not the name, not the recognition. The ripples that spread outward from a single moment of clarity in the chaos. She closed her eyes and counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sleep came eventually. It always did. 3 years after the ridge. Megan stood at a podium in front of 200 recruits, her hands gripping the edges of the lectern, her eyes scanning the young faces before her. They were fresh, eager, terrified in the way that all recruits are terrified, not of the training, but of what the training meant, what it prepared them for. She had been asked to speak about leadership under pressure. It wasn't the first time. Since the ridge, she had been pulled into training exercises, mentorship programs, guest lectures. The military had decided she had something to teach, and so she taught it, Not because she wanted recognition, but because the lessons she had learned were too important to keep to herself. You're going to face situations where everything breaks down, she began. Your communications will fail. Your equipment will malfunction. Your plans will collapse. And in that moment, when chaos is everywhere and nothing makes sense, you will have a choice. She paused. Then the silence built. You can panic. You can freeze. You can wait for someone else to fix the problem. Or you can count. The recruits shifted in their seats. Some of them recognized the reference. Others did not. Counting is how you survive shock. It's how you control fear. It's how you impose structure on a system that has lost all structure. When you count, you give your brain something to hold on to, a rhythm, a framework. And once you have that framework, you can start to rebuild. She told him about the ridge. Not the sanitized version from the training manuals. The real version. The first man who died. The chaos of the tent. The frost on the poles. The grease pencil. The tally marks. She told him about the counting. I counted through 30 hours of hell. Every shot I fired. Every patient I triaged. Every minute that passed while we waited for the storm to break. And because I counted, I stayed functional. I stayed focused. I stayed alive. She looked at them, 200 faces, some skeptical, some rapt, all of them wrestling with the same question. Could I do that? Some of you will face moments like that. Most of you won't. But all of you will face moments where everything seems impossible, where the math doesn't work, where the odds are against you. And when that happens, I want you to remember one thing. She leaned forward. Count. Start with 1. Move to 2. Keep going until you reach 10. And then start over. Because as long as you're counting, you're not panicking. As long as you're counting, you're thinking. And as long as you're thinking, you can find a way through. The lecture ended. The recruits filed out. Some of them stopped to ask questions about the ridge, about the system, about her career. She answered them all with the same flat, practical tone she used for everything. When the room was empty, she gathered her notes and walked toward the exit. A young woman was waiting in the hallway, mid-20s, sniper candidate, based on the patches on her uniform. She had dark hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that carried a familiar weight. Sergeant Hale, that's me. I wanted to say thank you for the lecture. You're welcome. The woman hesitated. I've heard the stories about the ridge, about what you did. Stories get exaggerated. Maybe, but the numbers don't. 120 evacuated. 96 still alive today. That's not an exaggeration. Megan looked at her. Really looked for the first time. What's your name? Martinez. Elena Martinez. Where are you from, Martinez? Texas. Small town outside San Antonio. Why did you join? The question seemed to catch Martinez off guard. She thought for a moment before answering. Because I wanted to do something that mattered. Something bigger than myself. Megan nodded slowly. That's a good reason. Hold on to it. When things get hard, and they will get hard, that reason is what will keep you going. What keeps you going? The question was direct, honest. The kind of question that only the young ask before they learn to be afraid of the answers. Megan considered it. Counting, she said finally. Counting keeps me going. It's not dramatic. It's not inspirational. But it works. Martinez nodded, absorbing the answer. Thank you, Sergeant. Stay safe, Martinez. And when you're out there in the cold, in the chaos, remember to count. The young woman walked away. Megan watched her go, then turned and walked toward the exit. Outside, the sun was setting over the training complex, red and gold and purple, spreading across the horizon like watercolor on canvas. She allowed herself 30 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Then she walked back to the barracks, her mind already turning to the next mission, the next challenge, the next set of numbers to count. The final count came 5 years after the ridge. Megan learned about it in a letter, old-fashioned paper, delivered to her quarters at a training facility where she was spending 6 months as an instructor. The envelope bore the insignia of the VA medical system. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Dear Sergeant Hale, this letter is to inform you of the long-term outcomes for personnel treated at the Forward Aid Station during the incident designated Operation Whitefall, colloquially known as a Ridge. Of the 108 personnel evacuated to definitive care following the engagement, 96 survived initial treatment and returned to duty or were medically discharged. 91 remain living as of the date of this correspondence. 86 are in good or excellent health with no significant long-term complications. 5 experience ongoing medical issues related to injuries sustained during the incident. The families of the 12 personnel who died during the incident, as well as the 5 who have passed since, have been notified separately. On behalf of the medical staff who treated these personnel, we wish to acknowledge your contributions to their survival. While we understand that you have declined previous recognition, please know that your actions on Ridge have not been forgotten. Respectfully, Dr. Sarah Chun, Director of Long-Term Care Outcomes, Veterans Affairs Medical Center. Megan read the letter 3 times. 91. That was a number now. Not 120. Not 96. 91. Time took its toll, even on those who survived. But 91 was still a number. Still something she could hold on to. She folded the letter and placed it in the drawer of her desk, alongside the other artifacts she collected over the years. A fragment of shrapnel that had nearly killed Reyes. A photograph of the ridge taken by a drone after the extraction. A copy of the ADP training manual with her annotations in the margins. And a single tally mark scratched into the wood of the drawer with a ballpoint pen. She had made it the night she returned from the ridge. A reminder, a promise. 1. It meant I survived. It meant this happened. It meant, Count. That evening, she walked to the edge of the training facility and looked out over the landscape. It was spring here, and the world was alive with green. Birds sang in the trees. Flowers bloomed along the fence line. The air smelled like growth and renewal and the promise of things to come. She thought about the men from the ridge, the 91 who were still alive, the 17 who weren't. She thought about their faces, which she remembered with perfect clarity even after 5 years. She thought about their names, which she had learned eventually one by one, through letters and phone calls and chance encounters. She didn't carry guilt. Guilt was useless. Guilt didn't save anyone. What she carried was something else, a weight that balanced against the numbers, a responsibility to remember what had been lost alongside what had been preserved. The sun set slowly, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Megan counted the colors as they shifted. 1, 2, 3. She counted the clouds as they drifted. 4, 5, 6. She counted the heartbeats in her chest. 7, 8, 9. And when she reached 10, she didn't stop. She kept counting higher and higher until the numbers lost their meaning and became something else entirely. A rhythm, a structure, a way of holding on to the world when the world threatened to slip away. She stayed there until full dark. Then she walked back inside, cleaned her rifle, and prepared for the next day. There was always another day. There was always another count. The angel of war returned to her quarters and slept without dreaming. In the morning, she would wake up and do it all again. Another mission, another set of numbers, another chance to impose order on the chaos that was the only constant in a warrior's life. That was the legacy she had built, not medals or commendations or entries in history books. Just the knowledge that somewhere 91 men and women were alive because she had picked up a greased pencil and started counting. 1, 2, 3. The numbers never stopped. They never would. And Megan Hale, the woman they called the Angel of War, would keep counting until her last breath, because that was how you survived. That was how you saved others. That was how you lived. One moment at a time, one number at a time, forever.